Hey guys, and welcome back, and in today's video we'll be looking into how we can use Spring Cache and learn some of its concepts. Then we will extend this further to integrate Ehcache 3 and add some configurations in order to specify the off heap space and then the expiration policy. So with this, let's get started. So let's go to start.spring.io and create a project. So I'm going to call this as com.amrut.prabhu and I'm going to add some dependencies. So I'm going to add Spring Cache. So you're going to add this Spring Cache abstraction. So this is what is required for the Spring Cache implementation, and I will be adding one more dependency, that is the web dependency. Now I require only this dependency in order to have some REST call so that I can test the caching mechanism. You don't require the web dependency for the actual cache implementation as such. I'm going to call this as simple caching service, and I'm going to use Java 17 and the rest remains the same. I'm going to generate this project. Now I've already created this particular project and populated it with some code. So let's look at that. So here we have the main class. So this is the main class through which the application starts. And here I have a web service. So now what this web service has, it has a get mapping here for a name, and it has a get mapping for a person, and it has an evict method. Before we go into the evict part, let's look at how we can actually cache a particular value. Now I have this particular service which has a method called as generate person. Let's go into this and see. Now in this I have this annotation called as CachePut and an annotation called as Cachable. Now in the CachePut, that is on top of the generate person, this is one of the Spring concepts that we have, that in case of a CachePut, the actual method is actually being called, but it keeps on updating this particular cache. So now here I have defined a particular cache store, which is a cache name, and I've defined a key that is a name itself. Now this particular key comes from the input here. Now this is the Spring expression language that we can use to specify a particular key. Now this is just because we have right now a single input, which is a string. Now in case if you had like an object or something, in that case you would specify the particular key in this particular format. Like for example, I have this particular person which has three attributes. It has ID, name and address, right? Now if I want to refer to this particular name key, I define it in this particular fashion. So for the first simplest case, let's do one thing. Let's change this to Cachable. Now what does this Cachable do? So Cachable is a mechanism through which the output of this particular function is stored into the cache against this particular key. Now we are going to test how this thing works. Let's only test this particular annotation and see what happens. Now inside this, what we are doing is we are creating a person object with a random UUID, and then we are logging this particular person, and then we are returning this particular person. Simple. In the web service, we are just taking an input that is a name and generating that person and returning it. So now let's start this particular application. The application has started, so I'm going to now call this particular web service. So I have a curl request wherein I'm making a call with the name Jim here. So this is going to hit this particular service here and generate the persons. When I hit enter, as you can see here, a person gets generated here with this particular ID, that is a UUID, and the same UUID is been returned. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it some space and I'm going to call the same URL. So when I call the same URL, as you can see here, it doesn't actually generate a new UUID, nor does it print anything in the logs itself. This is because right now inside this particular cache store, we have already a key that is Jim, against which a person has already been stored into. So hence this particular method is not called. Now this is how the Cachable annotation works. Now let's do one thing. Let's change this to something called as CachePut. Now let's start this particular application and see what happens. So the application has now started. Now let's do one thing. Let's make a call again. Now here I'm going to make a call to the same REST endpoint with the same name, right? So Jim, and in this case, if you see, a person got generated with a particular UUID. let me scroll through this particular log a little bit and make the same call again. Now in this case, if you see, a new UUID got generated. And if you see in this log section here, you see a new person also got generated here. Now what happens in case of CachePut? Now in the case of CachePut, the actual method gets invoked and the output is again stored into the cache. So in this way, the cache store gets updated every time with the output of this particular function. Now you must be wondering what's the advantage of this, right? So for that, let's look at this other method. Now in this, I have kept the same cache store here and I have the Cacheble annotation here. Now here the key here I have specified as the name, which is the same as the name, but in this case I have a person object. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back and see where this function is called. Now I have yet another REST endpoint called as person, in which I'm specifying a particular name. Now I take this particular name and I create a new person object. Nothing, it's simple, it's just an empty UUID here, there's no address, and I'm just giving it a particular name. And I'm then going to call this fetch person here. The fetch person has this Cachable annotation. Now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to restart this particular application. So the application has now started. Let's go back to the terminal and make a call to the first endpoint, that is with Jim. In this case, you can see a new UUID got generated and a new person got generated. And similarly in the logs, you can see this particular person that was generated. Now, if I make a subsequent call to the same one, again, a new UUID gets generated and a new person gets generated here. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to call another endpoint, that is, in this case, I'm going to call the person endpoint. So now this person endpoint, which is here, I'm going to call that one with the name Jim. And when I press enter, so if you see here, this was the last generated value. And this was what was written when I called the person endpoint. Now, if I again try to call the previous endpoint, it generates a new one and stores this again in the cache. And then again on calling the person endpoint, it returns me the last stored value. Now this is the difference between CachePut and Cacheble. In case of Cacheble, if the key is already present, then it returns a value from the cache. In case of a CachePut, even though the key is already present in the cache, it would still make an execution of the function and update the cache with the new value inside the cache. So these are the two major concepts of Spring Cache. Now let's look at how we can evict it. Now for this, we have yet another REST endpoint, which is called evict, and that takes a name, and I'm going to create a particular person here, and I'm going to call this service called as evict person. Now in case of evict person, you have this annotation called as CacheEvict. And here I'm going to specify the same cache that we are using across all these particular functions, and I'm going to specify the same key, that is person.name. And in this, I'm not doing anything but just logging that the input person that has come in is evicted. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to restart this particular application. So the application has started again. Now I'm going to make a call back to the first endpoint. And this one generates this particular person, right? I'm going to call a second endpoint with the person just to be sure that we are getting the value from the cache. So here it has just printed once that it generated the person, and the second person endpoint returned us the value from the cache. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the evict endpoint. So I'm going to call evict with Jim as the value. And as you can see, it returns us an empty response because that particular Jim value has been evicted. Now, if I try to call the same person endpoint specifying Jim, it returns me an empty person. Why? Because right now there is no name key against this particular person stored inside the cache itself. Now, if I call the first endpoint to generate the person, it generates it, and on calling the person endpoint, it actually returns me the last stored value. So now these are the major concepts of your CachePut, your Cacheble, and the CacheEvict. So by default, when we just include the Spring Cache abstraction, it makes use of the Jcache implementation. Now what are we going to do is, we're going to enhance this further to use another provider called as Ehcache. Now there are quite many providers that you can integrate, such as Redis, then you have Couchbase, you can also integrate Infispan and many other providers. But then today we'll be integrating Ehcache 3. For Ehcache 3, we need to do some kind of configuration. So let's look at that actually. So first thing what we need to do is we need to add two dependencies. So we have one dependency here called as Cache API and the other one as Ehcache. So I'm going to uncomment this and build the project. The other thing that we need is a configuration. So we have this particular app configuration here. Let me show you what this thing is. So in this configuration, if you see here, what I have created, I've created like a cache configuration builder wherein I've specified a particular cache wherein the key is going to be a string and the value is going to be a person. Also, I have specified certain configurations that specify for how long I want this particular cache to be present. So I have provided a cache expiration policy such that the cache can be evicted after 10 seconds if the particular key is not in use, and the cache memory is going to be off the heap. I can also keep it on the heap also by just using the other method, but here I've specified that 10 MB would be off the heap for this particular caching. Along with this, now I also then create this cache manager specifying this cache store, and that's it. This is the minimal configuration that you'll need to integrate Ehcache 3. So with this, let's build the application and start the application again. So if you look into this logs, you can see it's allocating 10 megabytes in chunks for the caching mechanism, and the cache store has been created inside the Ehcache manager. And then it's actually registering this particular bean here. So now the Ehcache mechanism has been integrated. Now let's make the series of calls. Now here I'm going to create a particular person, Jim. So a person has been created. So now I'm going to request another one, and then I'm going to create yet another one. So here all the IDs are different. Now I'm going to call the person endpoint. Now in the person endpoint, if you see, this same ID has been written. Now what's the time difference between these two is not within 10 seconds, right? So that's the reason it returned me this particular same ID. Now, since more than 10 seconds have now passed through, and if I call the person endpoint again, it returns an empty person. So right now it is 56 seconds here, and the last call that I made was 36 seconds. So nearly 20 seconds have passed through and the cache got evicted. So because of the expiration policy, the key that was not last used for the 10 seconds was evicted. Now if I generate the person again and try to hit the person endpoint again, since it's within the 10 seconds, it returned me the same person. Now after waiting for now literally 10 seconds, if I make the person endpoint again, it returns me the empty person. So with this, we just saw some of the major concepts of Spring Cache, and we also saw how we can configure Ehcache 3. Now, if you like this particular video, give it a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe to this particular channel to see more such kind of videos. Till then, take care and see you in my next one.